You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 18th of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 4 here at Dufourstrasse 90 in Zurich. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme.
The goal of the Israeli government is abundantly clear: the destruction of life in Gaza.
The UN's embattled Human Rights Council commences its summer session in Geneva. Has it made it too easy for its critics to constrain it? Also ahead, Iran's supreme leader addresses his nation after 6 days of air war with Israel. We'll have the latest. We'll look at how the Swiss economy can clamber out of what is, at least by Swiss standards, a downturn. We'll hear from our team at the Abu Dhabi Infrastructure Summit. And as Art Basel continues not far from here, we'll look at what the fair means for the city and the region. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. Underway in Geneva right now is the summer session of the UN's Human Rights Council. The UNHRC is a much criticised and indeed much mocked institution, and not altogether without reason. Its current membership includes several countries rarely, if ever, acclaimed as shining exemplars where human rights are concerned, among them China, Burundi, Cuba, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia and Sudan. This has arguably made it difficult to resist recent calls for financial restraint, which has led, among other strictures, to shortened debates, which may be kind of a relief to all concerned. I'm joined with more by Michel Langrand, a journalist and co-desk editor at Geneva Solutions. Michel, before we move on to the organisation's current travails, in theory, what does it actually do?
Hi, Andrew. Thank you very much for having me. So the Human Rights Council, I mean, as you mentioned, it is going through a really hard time at the moment. This is despite the fact that the discussions that it has over the different human rights crises around the world, in essence, are you can say to a certain extent symbolic, right? So it can adopt state members can adopt resolutions, they can condemn, they can appoint commissions of inquiry or experts to look into some of these situations, but they cannot enforce any decisions or force any countries to change their behaviors, right? So this is throughout the 3 weeks that we have ahead of us. They will be discussing different issues, from Gaza to women's rights to rights of migrants to the situation in Sudan and in other conflict-affected countries.
I mean, it is often criticised, as I was foreshadowing, as an apparatus by which somewhat dismal police states can launder their reputations. Is that entirely unfair?
To a certain extent, of course. I mean, it is a body that is composed of states, right? So as part of the UN, they all have a right to try to get into the council, which is made up of 47 members. There is a regional distribution there, so they of course try to get on. They try to block any resolutions, condemnations, or investigations that would look into their own abuses, right? So you can say that there are efforts from countries like China that will go to really great lengths, right, to try to quash any attempts to denounce its human rights abuses. So from that standpoint, I think that it is true that there is an attempt to try to not only quash any criticism, but also try to make themselves look good. For example, China always talking about development and its great advances in lifting its population out of poverty. So that in that sense, I think that criticism is fair.
I mean, as I was saying at the top, one of the effects that the new budget constraints are going to have will be shorter debates, shorter speeches and shorter sessions, but that's obviously not going to claw back all the money they need to save. What else is the council not going to be able to do?
So some of the measures that you've just mentioned were measures that were taken, they're temporary measures, right, for this session and for the next one. This is to do with the lack of liquidity at the moment. Now, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, just submitted a letter, I think yesterday, to the Council's president, explaining that some 20 activities, meaning reports and debates that were supposed to take place between this year and next year, could no longer take place because they don't have the money to go ahead with that. So it's at different levels. Now there are more long-term efforts to try to bring back some of this. Cut back on some of the spending from the council. And this effort means, for example, looking at that many resolutions, right, that the council has. Some of these, the council has, I think, over 60 different mandates, from special rapporteurs to independent experts to commissions of inquiry. So a lot of mandates, and sometimes their activities might overlap. So one of the efforts that they want to try to push for is trying to rationalize this and maybe merge some of these mandates. Now, the question is, will they be able to convince the countries that have pushed for those mandates in the first place to give up their initiatives?
And just finally, is it likely that the committee's belt is going to get tightened further still? The United States, which is not just under the Trump administration, it has to be said, has been a non-fan of this organization for some while, is now saying that US funds will be banned from reaching the HRC. This is at least a White House proposal before Congress.
Right. So this isn't the first time that the U.S. has, under the first Trump administration, they had already banned funding. So what they mean by this is, so the U.S. provides, they have a mandatory contribution that they have to give to the UN, and from this budget, the Human Rights Council is funded. So if they kind of prevent that money from going there, that means that the Volker Turk's office, which is the one that supports the Human Rights Council and all of its works, all of the experts that present reports to it, will have to figure out a way to fulfill and sort of continue to support this work without the U.S. funding. And now this, of course, puts it in a really tight position, because as you probably know, the U.S. Covers 22% of the UN's regular budget.
Michel Langrand, thank you very much for joining us. That was Michel Langrand, journalist and co-desk editor at Geneva Solutions. You're listening to The Briefing. Here is Monocle's Tom Edwards with the day's other headlines.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Dozens of flights to and from Bali have been cancelled after a volcano erupted near the island, sending a large ash cloud into the sky. The cancellations have left many tourists stranded and caused concern for Bali's tourism industry. Authorities have raised the highest alert level and told people to stay at least 7 kilometres from the crater. Japanese car exports to the United States fell by nearly a quarter last month after President Trump introduced new tariffs. The 25% tax is a major blow to Japan's manufacturing sector, where millions of jobs depend on the auto industry. The US spent about $40 billion on Japanese-made vehicles last year. And Copenhagen's biggest design festival, 3 days of design, kicks off today. The event runs through until Friday, with designers and brands from around the world showcasing their work across the city. Listen out for more on this and other stories from our team on the ground in the Danish capital, on Monocle Radio and across monocle.com. Those are the stories we're watching this hour. Back to you and the team in Zurich. Andrew?
Thank you, Tom, for that ebullient news summary. You are listening to The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller, and complaints from Switzerland about the state of its national economy are admittedly likely to summon a swelling crescendo of tiny violins from elsewhere. But we are where we are, i.e. Zurich, and there are concerns about the outlook for coming months. The State Secretariat for Economic Affairs has lowered its forecast for GDP growth to an unspectacular 1.3% for 2019. 2025 and a downright laggardly 1.2% for 2026. A tariff-related plummet in exports to the United States is partially responsible. Well, joining me now here in our Zurich studio is Holger Alech, a deputy editor of Handelszeitung. Holger, everything is relative, of course, but by Swiss standards, at least, how dramatic a falling off is this?
Well, we are still not in a very dramatic situation because unemployment is still at levels of about 3%, so we don't have a social crisis. But of course, looking forward, the landscape is not very compelling. We still don't know what the Trump tariffs will be for Switzerland, and the time is running up until the 9th of July. Switzerland is negotiating, but we still don't know what will be the come out. And remember, the US is the single biggest markets for exports from Switzerland. So how we are going from here depends very strongly on the outcome of these negotiations.
Is it possible to identify what Swiss exports have been especially badly affected?
Well, in the first quarter, we had a positive effect because, for example, the pharmaceutical sector, which is one of the biggest exporter in the US, has stockpiled. So we have an up-running effect, if you want. Probably we will see a downturn now in the second quarter. This will have, of course, an immediate effect on the Swiss GDP numbers. But furthermore, the machine industry, which is not so prominent because these are more small and mid-sized companies, not so behemoth like Novartis and Roche, everyone knows. They are the backbone of the Swiss economy, and they suffer from the unclarity on the tariffs. And secondly, they suffer more, of course, on the strengthening of the Swiss francs. And this, for example, will be an important topic coming up this Thursday when Swiss national banks will decide on how going forward with the interest rates.
Which is something I did want to ask about. Are there any, I don't know to the extent to which the Swiss National Bank either foreshadows its moves or just outright leaks, but do we know what they're likely to decide on Thursday? What are people betting on?
Well, the consensus is they will go down 25 basis points to 0%. There were some talking about at economists that they might go even lower. You know, Switzerland is one of those countries who has had several years after the great financial crisis, negative interest rates, something that is completely, uncharted territory at that time, but we managed quite well to do so with some side effects, which I won't elaborate too long. But normally, I don't think that that the SNB will go to negative territory this time. Why? Because after the attack of Israel on Iran, there was the thinking that perhaps that the euro might go down further, even the dollar. For the euro, the SNB might have some leverage with interest rate, but definitely not on the dollar because it's far too big, the market. So I don't think even, and furthermore, the inflationary numbers don't justify now to really go beyond zero. So to sum it up, we'll all expect that we'll have 25 basis points down to just zero.
You mentioned earlier that the slight tailing off in GDP forecasts, and I think it's correct to point out that this is far from a calamity, but had not occasioned any great social crisis in Switzerland. Does that ever happen in Switzerland, though? Because usually in other countries, at times of any sort of economic turbulence, everybody blames the government and points fingers at them and says it's all your fault, whether there's anything they could have done about it or not. Is that the case here or not so much?
Interestingly enough, I would say, but this is my personal view, it's the other way around, because we have had some interesting decisions voted by the Swiss population. As you know, we have popular votes here, and they voted some costly costly expanding of the social system. For example, although our pension system, the pay-as-you-go system, has, because of demographics, like in every industrial countries, structural deficits and structural problems, the Swiss voted to get a 13th pension a year, which is completely unfunded. And this, of course, is tearing down the economy because this has to be financed. It's a popular vote. Now the government must comply. And the proposition is that they raise taxes and raise the social security contribution, which, of course, is a drag on the competitiveness on the country. So I think that people don't realize that we are really at the edge and that this growth in Switzerland is cannot be taken for granted. We have to take care about the competitiveness of the Swiss economy, which is, at my point of view, at stake.
So just finally, is this perhaps one of the benefits of Switzerland's direct democracy, that every so often the politicians get to blame the voters?
That's one advantage, but the disadvantage is that it is makes reforms slower. For example, now in Germany, for example, the new government, they say at last to do so. They will financial reforms, etc. They will reform the economy. In Switzerland, the government, no one is talking about structural reforms because they know it will be extremely hard to push it through. But I think that can't be. So they have to get things right and have to move on. Otherwise, we'll have really problems in the upcoming years.
Holger Alec, Deputy Editor of Handelszeitung, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. Within the last hour, Iran's Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has had some remarks delivered on his behalf on Iranian television. This follows 6 days of airstrikes exchanged between Iran and Israel and accelerating speculation that the United States may join the fight on Israel's side, a prospect lent credence, advertently or otherwise, by US President Donald Trump's calls for Iran's unconditional surrender and ambiguous reassurance that the US had no plans to kill Khamenei, at least, quote, for now. Well, joining us now from London is Nega Anga, former advisor to the State Department and White House National Security Council, now a fellow at the Wilson Center's Middle East program. First of all, Nega, what did the Supreme Leader have relayed to the Iranian nation on his behalf? Did he have anything new to say?
Thank you for having me. Look, the Supreme Leader, as you just said, was issued an official statement. He wasn't actually live in front of the press, as he had stated, essentially warning President Trump of irreparable harm, right, if the U.S. joins Israel's strike targeting these underground nuclear sites. And again, in response to President Trump calling for unconditional surrender. So essentially, Khamenei said, in his prepared statement, that Iran will not surrender. And we have to think about this. Khamenei is essentially staring down two poisons. It's either escalate and risk the regime's collapse in the short term, or hold back and risk losing strategic deterrence in the long run. And despite the violence that's happening, Iran continues to signal it still wants an off-ramp. This isn't just about brinkmanship at this point, it's about survival. So from my perspective, there is still a diplomatic window. It's narrowing. Egypt has recently entered into the conversation. It's been silent over the last 6 days. It's proposing to be an arbitrator. But again, Khamenei's statement was reiterating that if the U.S. enters the war, there will be full-blown war, that you could see that there is sort of this aspiration for an off-ramp.
I do want to come back to the questions of what options Iran has left to it at this point, but on the optics of this speech, is it surprising or weird to you that Khamenei did not appear in front of the cameras himself?
There's quite a bit of speculation circulating even over the last few minutes since the statement came out. Some of it has to do with whether or not he was in good health to be able to issue it. Some of it was related, some speculation is security, as the statements coming out from the U.S. and Israel about knowing exactly where Khamenei is right now. So it's sort of a question of security. Some of it was, again, trying to calibrate the messaging and then having an official spokesperson reading out his official statement, sort of, bringing down the tension, bringing down the rhetoric.
You did mention before that there was still a diplomatic window, as you put it. I'm trying to avoid the mixed metaphor of an off-ramp leading to a window. That just makes absolutely no sense at all. But his options have narrowed, haven't they? By which I mean Khamenei's. He doesn't seem like he's in a position to defeat Israel militarily, still less the United States. So what advantage would there be for him to prolonging this conflict?
Well, again, as I said, he's got these two unfortunate two poisons, right? If he's able to hold back, there is sort of this risk of losing strategic deterrence. But I think what we need to do is take a step back of the way both Iran is viewing the situation, but also, in a lot of the conversations within the U.S. government of, what can be done to help neutralize this threat. I mean, for Israel right now, it's solving its own Iran problem. It's weakening the state to the point of collapse. It obviously introduces a new risk, a failed Iran state. It will no longer be a threat to Israel, but it opens up a more direct threat to the U.S. and its Gulf allies, the neighbors of Iran. And that's the calculation that's being weighed right now of where that stands. So when you have these various conversations of various others entering the conversation to help broker some deal, this is the concern. This is sort of the broader regional war that everyone is worried about.
And it's hard to say in this specific situation whether it's an advantage or a disadvantage, but how difficult is it to get a grip on the United States' possible intentions due to the character of the United States' current president? Because we've seen some statements from Trump over the last 24 to 48 hours suggesting everybody in Tehran should evacuate, which, as anybody who has been to Tehran knows, would be no small undertaking. If any other US president ever had said that, that would be interpreted as more or less a declaration of war, whereas now nobody can really tell, does he mean this or is he just saying stuff?
Indeed. That's a $1 million question right now, but we have to look at the facts at hand. U.S. forces are moving into the region, not just to deter Iran, but to prepare for potential contingencies. You see carrier strike groups, long-range bombers, ISR assets are all being positioned strategically. So this isn't performative anymore. It's preparatory. Obviously, as you rightly noted, back in 2004, the Biden administration walked that razor's edge, showing strength without getting sucked into a war with Iran. So that balancing act wasn't just about geopolitics, but it was to be able to control certain narratives. We're entering into a completely new political terrain. To a certain extent, whether there's a clear strike that could be on the table for the Trump administration won't just be a military one, it'll be a political decision. I think one of the things that, as we start reading the tea leaves, that we should pay attention to is kind of where are the MAGA-aligned voices leading? 6 days ago, they were essentially asking for restraint. They were asking for, focus back on the U.S. immigration issue, but they're now lining up behind Trump's hardline stance against Iran's nuclear program. And I guess, to provide sort of a sense of Trump's calculus, Trump is not a hawk. Trump is not a realist. Trump is not a restrainer. He's a popularist. He backs what he thinks looks like strength, what he thinks is kind of the winning hand. And at this moment in time, he's leaning into this Israel-Iran conflict, and it's indeed a gamble, and it could turn into a very prolonged and unpopular war that could backfire politically. It's just concerning that his risk could be misjudging what he hopes will be a win.
Negar Anger, former White House advisor, now of the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is the briefing live from Zurich with me, Andrew Muller. The Abu Dhabi Infrastructure Summit is still underway in the emirate of that name. And joining me now from Abu Dhabi with the latest are Monocle's editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, and Monocle Radio's executive producer, Carlotta Rebello. Carlotta, we'll come to you first. We did hear from Andrew yesterday. How are you finding it on arrival?
Oh, it's been amazing, Andrew. It's been such a wonderful couple of days. Quite hot, and where else to be than in a huge conference center with AC overlooking the outside. It's been actually an amazing 2 days, hearing from people from all sides of, the urbanism sphere. We've spoken to city leaders, to planners, to architects, interior designers, and it really has been this focus on quality of life and livability that has stood out for me. When you think about an infrastructure summit, you might just think about bridges and roads and the actual built environment of a city. But it's been these soft approaches and, talking about public space that really has come to mind.
And Andrew, to bring you in, when we spoke yesterday, you talked a lot about the agility of the Emirates relative to most other places in terms of being able to get projects started and indeed finished. Today, as I understand it, you've been discovering how to get planning permission in a day.
Yes, a gentleman called His Excellency Abdullah Al-Blushi came on to the show, and it was really fascinating. He's worked on this project driven by AI, and they get 20,000 applications a year, for example, just to build individual villas. Now, normally that takes a little while to go through the process. You have to check that the plans meet all of the codes, the building codes here. But now they've loaded all the codes up into AI, and he says that as long as you're compliant with the codes and you check as you upload the documentation, you'll get approval same day to build a house. Now, why that matters is they're determined to grow this country, and at a really fast pace. They're talking thousands of units, but they're still short. So when something goes up for sale here, it tends to sell within 24 hours as a new project goes live. Often just within a couple of hours. So they're trying to fast track all of these developments. And it's fascinating. It's done by AI. And, Andrew, you and me, let's not make this too parochial, but I would imagine if you live in a London borough, for example, and you've taken 9 months to try and get them to let you put a shed up, you might think, actually, perhaps they should buy some of this tech themselves.
And Carlotta, to bring you back in, we'll talk a bit about some of the housing they are building, because the Emirates are, of course, probably popularly associated with those big, flashy, headline-grabbing infrastructure projects. But that's not just what they're talking about at this summit. They are focused on more utilitarian things as well.
Yes, and it was a really interesting interview with one of the actual key partners here at the sponsor at the event, the Plenary Middle East. So I spoke with Mustafa Fahour, who's their COO, and they're associated with some of those big, flashy luxury developments, but they've also really invested in public housing in the UAE and also in student housing. And in the student housing, it is a partnership with the university, where traditionally students will have longer commutes to the campus, would be far away, likely not the best quality housing, and they've completely flipped that, and it's a model that is affordable, it's accessible, it's integrated with their tuition and integrated with part of their program. So it shows you the power that these public-private partnerships have to improve the lives of residents of all ages. It shouldn't be just that when you get to a point in your life that you are able to afford the flashy apartment, that you get to enjoy good quality design. And it's interesting to see a developer who also does that, putting the focus both in student housing and in public housing, which is so needed. As we know, the UAE is no exception to the housing shortages that are happening around the world. The difference is, of course, who tends to buy in this part of the world. So it was really refreshing to hear about someone trying to also cater to other parts of society too.
Carlotta Rebello, and Andrew Tuck at the Abu Dhabi Infrastructure Summit. Thank you both for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio, and finally on today's show, one of the reasons we are here this week, like we need one, is the proximity to Art Basel, occurring about an hour away by train. For more on what the fair means to the city and the region, I'm joined from just upstairs by Carlo Silberschmidt, Senior Account Manager at the global brand and creative agency Wing Creative. Carlo, welcome to the show, but on that subject first, I know we are technically in Zurich, not Basel, in fact, not just technically, in every respect we're in Zurich, not Basel, but what kind of knock-on effect does Art Basel have for the region when it happens?
Well, it starts, first of all, with the airport. Zurich Airport is super busy these days. But what's quite impressive is how in Switzerland, Basel has really become this center for art, for culture. You have Art Basel, but you have all the institutions, Fondation Bayerler, which is highly respected, in the area Kunsthalle Basel. And it's really this mecca where everyone wants to be this week.
I mean, how important do you think it has been, though, to, I guess, widening people's perceptions of what Switzerland is all about?
We have this reputation of chalets, meadows and skiing, and finally there's some cool kids dancing in Basel, and it's actually true. It's this week is fantastic, and it's not just the fair. Obviously, it started with that, but emerging from it, there have been so many off spaces, side fairs. But for example, Basel Social Club, which is ongoing at the moment in a former bank, is where everyone wants to be and be seen, and these are people that then later also decide to spend the rest of their life in Switzerland.
We will be hearing much more about Art Basel across our shows this week, of course, but I did want to ask you about something else. It's not a regional peculiarity because everywhere in Europe has summer at this time of year, but Switzerland, as it does with so many things, deals with summer in a particular way. It starts officially on June 21st, and as certainly Chris and I have been discovering at our hotel, they will do almost anything to address this other than switch on the air conditioning. But Geneva does have some ideas.
Indeed, Geneva is testing out something that actually other cities are also implementing, or a number of high-tech materials and fans that should really help anyone who's walking around in the heat of the summer to cool down. These are very large fans that spray light water, or it's shadow tarps put up over large squares, or in some instances they call it micro oases, which should give a bit of a cooling a break when walking through Geneva.
I mean, just finally, I was wondering if you could provide a bit of perspective on this, because I think it is something that a lot of guests to Switzerland do find a bit bewildering, to the extent that, in fairness to, I think, the receptionist at a hotel who fields this question several hundred times a day, they've actually put up a little notice in a frame where you can read, "Here's why we're insane about air conditioning."
I grew up without air conditioning, and it would be very foreign to me to put an air conditioner in my house. I'd rather jump into the lake, sit in the shade, or actually what they do in Basel is they go swimming in the fountains.
Is this something that is likely to be, taken up popularly, do you think, across Switzerland, though? Because I can see practical difficulties with, going back to work somewhat soggy.
There are some difficulties, and I know that lots of businesses especially are struggling with a productivity drop because everyone's just spending their days in the lake, literally, missing on calls and meetings just to get a bit of cool down.
Well, if listeners to The Daily this evening detect a bit of squelching noise from behind the presenter's microphone, they'll know what's happened. Carlo, thank you. That was Carlo Silberschmidt, Senior Account Manager at the global brand and creative agency Wing Creative. And that is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Chris Chermack and Desiree Badley. Our researcher was Henry King, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons, with editing assistance from Faith Eden. The Briefing returns tomorrow at the same time. I'm Andrew Muller. I will be back with The Daily later today, 1900 Zurich, 1800 London. Thanks for listening.